They tried to lease out my family's dock like it was some empty piece of community property nobody would notice. Except I grew up on that dock, and every board in it had my father's fingerprints pressed into the grain. The day I saw a forklift rolling down toward the shoreline, I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know yet that it would turn into a fight that would cost them over $300,000 and burn through half the neighborhood's goodwill along the way. I live in a quiet lakeside community up in northern Michigan, the kind of place where nothing dramatic is supposed to happen, where people wave from their trucks even if they don't like you, and where the biggest argument most summers is whether someone's boat music is too loud after sunset. My family had been there longer than most of the houses around us. Back in 1961, before there was even a formal HOA, my dad built a dock by hand. Cedar posts sunk deep into the lake bed, planks he planed himself in the garage, and this rope ladder he tied together one winter night because I kept slipping trying to climb up after swimming. He didn't say much when he worked, but everything he built had this quiet kind of permanence to it, like he expected it to outlast him. And it did. That dock became the center of everything. Summers meant early mornings with fog lifting off the water, my dad sitting there with a coffee in one hand and a fishing rod in the other, and me jumping in way too early in the season just to prove I could handle the cold. Birthdays, late-night talks, even the day I told him I was moving out, it all happened there. When he passed, the property transferred to me, clean and simple, deed and all. I remember sitting at the kitchen table afterward, flipping through the paperwork, thinking, well, at least no one can take this away. It felt like the one piece of him that stayed put. For a while, that was true. Then one afternoon in early June, I got a letter. Plain white envelope. HOA return address. Nothing about it looked urgent. I almost left it unopened on the counter, but something about it bugged me, so I tore it open right there. It was a notice, formal language, a lot of legal phrasing, but the gist of it hit me like a slap. The HOA had entered into a 15-year commercial lease agreement with a boat rental company. They were granting exclusive access to what they called community waterfront zones, and right there, buried in the second paragraph, was my dock listed as one of those zones. I actually laughed at first, not because it was funny, but because it made no sense. It felt like a mistake, like maybe they'd copied the wrong address or pulled an outdated map. I read it again, slower this time, tracing every line. No, they were serious. So I called the HOA office. Got voicemail. Left a message. Didn't hear back. 2 days later, a Tuesday morning, I'm making coffee when I hear this low mechanical hum coming from outside. Not the usual sound of a boat motor, something heavier. I step out onto the deck, and there it is, a flatbed truck parked near the path. A forklift already unloading these aluminum rack structures, the kind you see at marinas stacked with rental kayaks and jet skis. And there are 3 guys down by the water, already positioning the racks right on top of my dock. I didn't even grab shoes. I just walked straight down there. Hey, I called out, trying to keep my voice level. You guys got the wrong spot. One of them looked up, wiped his hands on his jeans, and gave me that look contractors give when they think you're about to slow them down. We're good, he said. We've got the paperwork. No, I said, stepping onto the dock, feeling that familiar creak under my feet. This is private property. You need to stop. That's when their manager came over, clipboard tucked under his arm, sunglasses on like he didn't have time for this. He flipped through a few pages and held one out toward me. Lease agreement, he said, tapping the header. We've got authorization from the HOA. This is designated community access. I didn't even take the paper. The HOA doesn't own this dock. He shrugged, already half turned away. That's not what they told us. If you've got an issue, take it up with them. And just like that, they went back to work. Bolts, drills, metal clanging against cedar that had been there longer than any of us. I stood there for a second, trying to process what I was seeing, feeling this slow burn building in my chest. Not panic, not yet, just this deep, steady kind of anger. Because it wasn't just about the dock, it was the way they said it, like it was already decided, like I didn't matter in the equation. So I drove straight to the HOA office. It's this small building near the entrance to the community, more decorative than functional, with a flagpole out front and a bulletin board full of outdated notices. Inside, I found the president, a guy named Richard Holbrook. Retired contractor, late 60s, always carried himself like he was still running a job site. He looked up when I walked in, gave me that polite smile that never quite reached his eyes. I got your letter, I said, holding it up, and I just watched a crew start installing commercial racks on my dock. He leaned back in his chair like he'd been expecting this conversation. That's part of the new agreement, he said, calm, measured, like he was explaining something obvious. We're upgrading the waterfront for shared use. It's been discussed for months. Not with me, I shot back. That dock isn't shared. It's mine. He shook his head slightly, almost amused. The waterfront has always been considered common area under the association guidelines. You might want to review the bylaws. There was something about the way he said it, not aggressive, just dismissive, like the matter was already settled and I was just catching up. I stared at him for a second, then nodded slowly. All right, I said, I'll read them. And I did. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the bylaws spread out in front of me, reading every line, every clause, every amendment. And the more I read, the more something didn't sit right. The language was vague in places, sure, but it never explicitly said privately deeded waterfront structures became common property. It danced around the idea, implied shared use in certain zones, but nothing concrete. That's when I remembered something. A fireproof safe in the hall closet, one my dad had always kept locked, one he told me about before he passed, but I'd barely touched since. I pulled it out, spun the dial, and inside were the original documents, the deed, some old tax records, and underneath all that, a folded survey map dated 1958. I spread it out on the table, smoothing the creases with my hand, and started tracing the boundary lines. And that's when everything shifted. Because according to that survey, the property line didn't stop at the shoreline. It extended 50 feet out into the lake, which meant that dock, and the water beneath it, had never been community property, not for a single day. And sitting there, staring at that map, I realized something else too. Richard hadn't just made a mistake. He'd signed a deal on something he never owned. And I was about to make that very expensive for him. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was stressed, but because my brain wouldn't shut off. It just kept replaying everything. The letter, the forklift, Richard's calm little smile, the sound of metal drilling into cedar that had been there longer than that man had probably lived in the neighborhood. And every time I closed my eyes, I saw that survey map again. Those boundary lines stretching clean past the shoreline like my father had planned for this exact moment without ever knowing it. By morning, I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. I made coffee, sat down at the table, and went through everything again, slower this time, making notes, cross-referencing the deed with the survey, checking county records online just to make sure nothing had changed, no easements, no transfers, nothing buried in paperwork I might have missed. There wasn't. It was clean, clear, undeniable, which meant the HOA hadn't just overstepped, they'd exposed themselves. I called a local attorney, someone I'd heard about through a neighbor who dealt with a property dispute a few years back. His name was Daniel Price, mid-40s, sharp, not the kind of guy who wastes words. I drove into town that afternoon and laid everything out in front of him. The letter, the lease copy I'd taken a photo of, the survey, the deed. He didn't say much at first, just leaned back in his chair, flipping through the documents, occasionally nodding, occasionally raising an eyebrow like he was already seeing the angles. Finally, he set the papers down and looked at me. They leased private property, he said, plain and simple, like stating the weather. That's what I'm seeing, I replied. He gave a small smile. That's not just a mistake, that's liability. And that was the moment it really clicked, not just that I was right, but that they were in trouble. We talked options. He mentioned something called a quiet title action, basically a way to get the court to formally recognize and confirm ownership when there's a dispute. He also suggested something more immediate, a certified demand letter to the rental company. Because right now, he said, tapping the lease document, they think they're authorized. The second they know they're not, everything changes. So we drafted it right there. Clear, direct, no fluff. You are operating a commercial business on private property without the owner's consent. Remove all equipment and cease operations within 10 days, or you will be subject to trespass claims and damages. We sent it certified that afternoon. And then we waited. Well, I waited. The situation didn't. Because by the next morning, things were already shifting. I was down by the dock early, just watching, coffee in hand, taking in what they'd done so far. The aluminum racks were half installed, bolted down in sections, completely out of place against the weathered cedar. It looked wrong, like someone had dropped a piece of a marina into a memory. Around 9, a black SUV pulled up near the path. Out stepped the same manager from before, but he wasn't as relaxed this time. No sunglasses, no casual shrug. He walked straight toward me, holding a piece of paper. "You send this?" he asked, not even bothering with a greeting. "I did," I said. He looked back at the dock, then at the paper again. "We've got a signed lease." "From someone who doesn't own the property," I replied. There was a pause, just a second, but you could feel it shift. He wasn't brushing me off anymore. He was calculating. "We're going to need to talk to the HOA," he muttered. "That would be a good start," I said. He nodded, then turned and walked back to the SUV, already dialing his phone before he even got the door open. By that afternoon, I got my first call from Richard. His tone had changed. Gone was that calm, dismissive confidence. Now there was an edge to it, something tighter, controlled but strained. "We received your concerns," he said, like the word itself annoyed him. "And we're reviewing the documentation." "You should," I said. "Especially the part where you lease property you don't own." "That's not established," he snapped. "It will be," I replied, keeping my voice even. "In court if it has to be." Another pause. "You're overreacting," he said finally. "This is a community improvement project. Everyone benefits." "Everyone," I said, glancing out at the dock, at the metal frames sitting on top of something my father built with his hands. "Because it looks like I'm the only one losing something here." He didn't have an answer for that, not a real one. "We'll be in touch," he said, and hung up. 2 days later, the rental companies stopped all work. No announcement, no explanation, they just didn't show up. The rack stayed half-finished, tools gone, like someone had hit pause in the middle of a bad decision. And then the real fallout started. Daniel called me that Friday afternoon. "You're going to want to hear this," he said, and I could hear it in his voice, that quiet kind of satisfaction lawyers get when things start breaking their way. "The rental company filed suit this morning," he continued. "Against me?" I asked. "No," he said, almost amused. "Against the HOA." I leaned back in my chair. "For what?" "Fraudulent misrepresentation. They're claiming the HOA knowingly leased property they didn't have rights to." I let that sit for a second, then exhaled slowly. "How much?" "Initial claim is $120,000. That's the lease payment," he said. "Plus additional damages for equipment costs and projected lost revenue." And just like that, the scale of it shifted. This wasn't just about my dock anymore. This was turning into a full-blown legal mess. Over the next few weeks, everything moved fast. We filed the quiet title action with the county court, submitted all the documentation, the survey, the deed, even historical records showing the original property boundaries hadn't changed. It was airtight. Meanwhile, the HOA was scrambling. I heard things through neighbors, board meetings running late into the night, heated arguments, people asking questions they probably should have asked before signing anything. Richard stopped showing up around the common areas. When he did, he avoided eye contact. One afternoon, about 3 weeks in, he showed up at my door. No warning. I opened it, and there he was, looking older than I remembered, like the past few weeks had taken something out of him. "Can we talk?" he asked. I stepped outside, closed the door behind me. "What is it?" He took a breath, like he was choosing his words carefully. "This doesn't have to go further," he said. "We can resolve it." "Resolve it how?" I asked. "We terminate the lease, restore the dock, cover any minor damages," he said quickly. "Keep it out of court." I almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because of how predictable it was. "You already took it to court," I said. "Or did you forget about the lawsuit your tenant just filed against you?" His jaw tightened. "That's separate," he said. "No," I replied, shaking my head slightly. "It's really not." There was a moment there, tension hanging in the air, both of us knowing exactly where this was headed. "You're making this bigger than it needs to be," he said, a hint of frustration slipping through. I looked at him, really looked this time, and for the first time I saw it, not confidence, not authority, just a man who'd made a bad call and was now trying to contain it. "You made it big the second you signed that lease," I said quietly. "I'm just making sure it doesn't disappear." He didn't say anything after that, just nodded once, turned, and walked back to his car. And as I watched him leave, I realized something. This wasn't about misunderstanding anymore. This was about accountability. And it was only getting started. By the time the court date rolled around, the whole neighborhood felt different, quieter in some ways, but heavier too, like everyone knew something had gone wrong and nobody quite agreed on how bad it really was. You'd still get the usual waves, the small talk at the mailbox, but there was this undercurrent now, people picking sides without saying it out loud, some thinking I'd pushed too hard, others realizing maybe the board had gotten a little too comfortable making decisions no one checked. I stayed out of most of it. I wasn't interested in being right in the court of public opinion. I just wanted the actual court to do its job. 6 weeks after we filed, we got our hearing. It wasn't dramatic the way TV makes it look. No surprise witnesses, no shouting matches, just a small courtroom. A judge who'd clearly seen 100 cases like this, and two sides laying out what was, at its core, a very simple question. Who owns the property? Daniel handled most of it. Calm, precise, walking the judge through the documents like he was connecting dots that had been there all along. The 1958 survey, the deed transfer, the lack of any recorded instrument granting the HOA rights over that section of the waterfront. He didn't overcomplicate it, didn't need to. The HOA's attorney tried. I'll give him that. He leaned on interpretation, on implied shared use, on community precedent, but every argument circled back to the same problem. There was nothing on record backing it up. And in property law, if it's not recorded, it might as well not exist. The judge took a few minutes at the end, flipping through the documents again, then looked up. I'm not seeing any legal basis, he said, voice steady, almost bored, for the association's claim to this portion of the waterfront. That was it. No long speech, no dramatic pause, just a simple statement that landed heavier than anything else could have. He confirmed my title on the spot. Just like that, it was official. But that wasn't the end of it. Not even close. Because while my case was about ownership, the rental company's lawsuit was about consequences. And that one hit a lot harder. Over the next couple months, things unraveled for the HOA in a way I don't think any of them expected. Discovery pulled everything into the light. Emails, meeting notes, internal discussions, and what came out wasn't some elaborate scheme. It was almost worse than that. It was carelessness. They'd never verified the property boundaries before signing the lease. They'd assumed. They'd relied on outdated assumptions and never cross-checked them against actual records. And when the rental company's attorneys laid that out, piece by piece, it painted a picture that was hard to defend. At some point, the HOA filed a claim with their insurance. That got denied. Reason was simple. The board had acted outside reasonable due diligence. No verification, no title check, nothing that would have caught something this basic. Which meant the liability didn't sit with the association as a whole. It sat with the individuals who signed the agreement. Richard and 2 other board members. I remember the day Daniel called me with the final number. Judgment came through, he said. I was sitting out on the deck, looking at the lake, the dock still half covered in those aluminum racks that no one had come back to finish. How bad? I asked. There was a brief pause. 340,000. I let out a low whistle, leaning back in the chair. That's more than I expected. Covers the lease, damages, legal fees, he said. They didn't hold back. No, they didn't. A week later, Richard resigned. No announcement, no speech, just a notice posted on the community board that he was stepping down effective immediately. The other 2 followed not long after. And just like that, the people who'd been so certain, so confident in that office weeks earlier, were gone. It was strange, honestly. You spend all that time building towards something, imagining how it'll feel when it's over, and then when it is, it's quieter than you expect. No victory parade. No real sense of closure from the outside. Just space. So that weekend, I went down to the dock. No lawyers, no neighbors, no conversations, just me and a toolbox. The aluminum racks were still bolted in, half finished like they'd been abandoned mid-thought. I started there, loosening each bolt, one at a time, the metal giving way with that sharp, hollow sound that echoed out over the water. It took hours longer than I expected, but I didn't rush it. Didn't feel like something to rush. By late afternoon, the last of it was gone. Just a pile of aluminum sitting off to the side and the cedar planks underneath, scuffed up, marked where the racks had been pressed down, but still solid, still holding. I grabbed a sander the next day and went back over it, slow passes, letting the wood breathe again, watching that fresh, pale surface come through like it had years ago. There's something about that kind of work, repetitive, steady, gives you time to think without overthinking. About my dad. about how he would have handled all this. And I kept coming back to the same thought. He probably wouldn't have said much. He would have just fixed what needed fixing. At one point, I moved toward the edge of the dock, near where the ladder had always been. The aluminum had covered it up, pinned it down in places, but as I cleared the last section, there it was. The rope ladder, still tied to the post, still holding. I knelt down, brushed some dust off it, ran my hand along the knots, and they were exactly the same. Tight, deliberate, a little uneven in places because he never cared about making things look perfect, just making sure they worked. I don't know how long I stayed there, just sitting, looking at it. But for the first time since all of this started, I felt something settle. Not anger, not even relief, really. Just right. Like things were back where they were supposed to be. By sunset, the dock looked like itself again. Not brand new, but honest. And that was enough. Now, here's the part people keep asking me about. Was it worth it? All the time, the stress, the tension with neighbors, dragging something like this through court instead of letting it go quietly. And the honest answer is, I don't know if worth it is the right way to look at it. Because it wasn't about winning. It was about not letting something get taken just because someone else assumed they could. Maybe the board didn't mean to cross the line. Maybe they really thought it was community property. Or maybe they just didn't think anyone would challenge them. Either way, that line matters. So now I'm curious. If you were in my position, would you have pushed it all the way like I did? Or would you have taken the quiet deal and moved on? Because around here, people are still split on that. And honestly, I get why.